Before starting, let's think a little bit about what we're trying to evaluate. Because we've had quite a number of discussions, in particular in Maputo, where we realize that the expectations about what budget support should and should not achieve are really very different. To the extent that we're almost seem to be discussing two very different instruments. One set of instruments that we believe should be focused on poverty reduction, and another set of instruments that other agencies believe should be focused much more on governance. And this has been a sort of an underlying tension in some of the evaluation process, and indeed we can read it in the comments we receive from the various parties. I'll speak more on this, but just in order to recognize what has been achieved in Mozambique, it's important to start with the context. For various reasons, the last 5 years, I would say, have been a period of increasing skepticism over budget support. There's no particular reason why there should have been more skepticism. It's not that new evidence has emerged to suggest that budget support is more or less successful than people used to believe. Indeed, all of the evidence seems to suggest that it's contributing in positive ways. The precise reasons for skepticism relate much more to political changes, in particular within the European Union, but also to a degree in Canada, at the head of the World Bank, and in some of the international organizations. But the key point about this skepticism is that whereas 8 or 9 years ago there was a perception that one could overlook difficulties of governance, there is no longer such a perception. Any problem of governance is now placed under the microscope and is judged severely. Because budget support links so closely to the relationship with government, any problem in governance becomes associated with a problem of budget support. In a sense in which it doesn't when one is supporting the building of schools and hospitals and roads. Although in principle, if one builds a road for a corrupt government, it doesn't seem to be very different from making a transfer to the budget. But that's another debate. The key point is that this has been a period of some significant skepticism. Secondly, within Mozambique, it's been a period of an increasing concentration of political power. In the 2009 elections, the majority party, Frelimo, increased the number of seats it's had, so that the level of participation by the opposition in much of this period has been pretty modest. Simultaneously, within the ruling party, there's been an increasing concentration of power around the president and a fairly small number of ministers. So the openness in debate that perhaps characterized the period of 2000 to 2005 has been different in the more recent period. And there is no doubt at all that these factors have complicated the dialogue between government and its budget support providers. Indeed, there's been several moments when the relationship was quite close to breaking down. The Portuguese have a fabulous word, which I've still struggled to translate, which is crispação. Crispação, I suppose, means a period of tension. And there was a period of tension in 2010 after the 2009 elections when the budget support process very nearly broke down. And simultaneously with all of this, the Mozambican government is not simply trying to get started on poverty reduction, it's trying to deepen poverty reduction. It's trying to develop institutional frameworks for dealing with a mining boom that is forthcoming, and it's also trying to move to second generation reforms in relation to public finance management and public sector reform. So it's a much more complicated agenda than the period of 1994 to 2005, which Christina described earlier from the earlier evaluations. And I think this is something you need to keep in mind as I talk you through what has and has not been achieved. Our objectives in evaluating budget support were, at one level, quite simple: to assess how effective budget support had been in contributing to sustainable results on growth and poverty reduction. And in order to analyze that question more deeply, we break it down into 3 parts. One is really about providing the means to the government of Mozambique, by which we really refer to the financial means, to implement its own policies. Secondly, providing methods to facilitate improvements in the design and implementation of policy and strategy. by which we mean technical assistance, capacity building on the one hand, but also very substantially through policy dialogue. And then as a result of both funds and dialogue and capacity building, how successful has the overall process been in generating final outcomes and impacts? And we can see the same logic in the overall set of questions which mirror the intervention logic of budget support. So essentially what we see here is that we have a set of inputs which comprise funds, technical assistance and capacity building, but also policy dialogue, an evolving, and as I described, somewhat complicated context, some immediate outputs, which we describe as direct outputs related to more funds on budget, less transaction costs, more harmonization and alignment, and a more strategic, problem-focused policy dialogue, which in turn should help the government to induce certain outputs in terms of macro management, better public finance management, improved resource allocation and sector policies, and improved governance and accountability. As a consequence of these induced outputs, obviously interacting with the wider economy and society, we search for final impact on economic growth, income poverty reduction and equity, and on non-income poverty reduction, in particular relating to education and health outcomes. So that's the logic, and within this logic you will note that improved governance is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So the purpose of improving transparency and accountability is to make it easier to get better results in terms of income and non-income poverty, which, as I pointed out earlier, is not always the way each of the 19 agencies involved appear to view this instrument. Now, I won't take you through all of the big details of the evaluation methodology, but one of the key features of it is to try to make sure that we don't make an automatic jump between inputs and impacts. There's a little bit of a tendency, because it's all on a nice line, to say, well, look, we've provided the inputs, we've got some outputs, therefore we must achieve the outcomes. And so the methodology tries to break that down and to have a first step which looks at the linear relationship between 1, 2, and 3, and a second step that looks at the final outcomes and impacts and searches for what might be the determinants in a more open way using econometric and qualitative analysis. And then finally, we bring those together, because if we find that the key determinants are related to these induced outputs, then we can say that budget support is making a contribution to those final impacts. Okay? So that's the logic of steps 1, 2, and 3. Now, in trying to take you through the results, what we've tried to do, and I hope this doesn't confuse things, is to give you a picture of the overall logic and to give you a color scheme. So basically this is the same logic as I've just shown you. So we move from various inputs which are related to aspects of aid effectiveness to the induced outputs related to PFM, macro stability and growth, governance and resource allocation, to a range of outcomes and final impacts. Okay? And as we go through that, we'll rank the relative performance in terms of colors. So when I put green, that means we're doing reasonably well. When you see an orange, there's a sort of an intermediate result. And when we see a red, and unfortunately there is some red, that indicates poor results. Okay? So that's just to guide you through this quickly. Let's start from the beginning. Flow of funds. The key point about budget support in countries such as Mozambique, Tanzania, several others, is that it's a large amount of money. It makes a big difference to the ability of the government to deliver services. And in Mozambique, as we can see if you look here, budget support as a proportion of public spending at its peak was only just under 20% of public spending. And even now, with a much bigger budget and a much higher level of revenue, it's only just below 10%. So through most of this period, it's been a substantial contribution to the budget. In terms of its predictability, in other words, whether the amount of budget support which is committed is actually dispersed, it performs well, and in particular in comparison with other modalities. The green line here represents budget support, the blue line is common basket funds, and the red line is projects. So what we've done here is to take the budget at the beginning of the year, which tells us the level of resources the government anticipates of different kinds, and the actual execution figures at the end of the year, which tells us how much has been dispersed. So budget support, this early period was really just a problem with the projection process. But once the projection process had been sort of ironed out, we can see that in most years, it actually disperses around about 100% of what was promised. In several years, more than this. Whereas projects, there's much more variability in the first place, but let's say if there is an average, it's somewhere close to 60%, and for common basket funds, the average is somewhere close to 80%. So from the perspective of the government, and I think this is one of the reasons why Dr. Maituse emphasized that this is the preferred modality, budget support is far more predictable than the other two resources, and this is clearly borne out. The other thing worth looking at, although budget support attracts a lot of attention in Mozambique, it's never been the majority modality. Indeed, quite a long way from ever becoming so. At its peak, 2007, it reached about 35% of all ODA. But for most of the period, it's been somewhere around 20-25%. So 75% of aid to Mozambique is still provided through other modalities, a lot of that through projects, quite a bit through common basket funds. And needless to say, that creates quite a lot of what we might call noise. In other words, a lot of processes, a lot of complications, in particular at the sector level, something we're going to come back to. And the other issue about the mix of modalities is that whereas in the early years of budget support, which you'll remember was fairly close to the time of the Paris Declaration, the budget support process brought with it a move towards greater harmonization, more alignment. Since about 2010, there's been almost a move away from harmonization and alignment. And we can see this in quite a number of indicators. And this is one of the more negative points. Nevertheless, as a system of transfer of resources, it's certainly been efficient and it's been important for the government of Mozambique. Just without wanting to spend too much time on the issue of predictability, two other issues that are commitments made in the Memorandum of Understanding relate to what is called front-loading of budget support disbursements. That is to try to disperse the majority of the allocations in the first 2 quarters of the year. And secondly, to make a prediction on the quarter-by-quarter disbursements and to try and stick as closely to that as possible. We should remember that for the purpose of treasury management, these are quite large amounts of money. So if $100 million arrives in quarter 3 rather than quarter 1, that means that the government of Mozambique probably has to borrow from the central bank or issue additional treasury bills for that period of 6 months. So it's quite an important issue. On front loading, what we can see here, this darker part represents the proportion dispersed in the first quarter, this lilac one, the proportion dispersed in the second quarter. So for most of the period, we've had well over 50% dispersed in the first 2 quarters, in certain years reaching somewhere close to 70%. So it's been front-loaded, it's performing relatively well. This looks at the predictability by quarter. Now, if it was a flat line across the middle, that would mean that the predictions are exactly the same as the disbursements. We're getting perfect predictability. The movement up and down the line shows that we haven't got perfect predictability, but what we did have for quite a good period is relatively good predictability. So within this period, the disbursements by quarter are pretty close to what was predicted. That's a period of about 4 years. 2010, 2011 and 2012 have seen 3 troughs here, which are linked very directly to suspensions of budget support disbursement related to concerns over violation of underlying principles. The first of these, in the first quarter of 2010, related to concerns over irregularities in the elections of 2009. And there was a period of crispação in which the government and its donors examined what might be done to improve electoral management, to improve the representation of the opposition in Parliament, and to proceed with anti-corruption legislation. A governance action plan was established as a result, which has since very largely been implemented, and as we can see in the peak, disbursements followed on from that. At the beginning of 2011, there was a concern over a procurement problem in the health ministry, which led to a short-term delay. And at the beginning of 2012, there was a concern over a payroll problem in the Ministry of Education, which again led to a delay. We judge, as evaluators, that probably this first suspension was justified, in the sense that there were grounds for believing that underlying principles related to the respect for democracy and human rights might have been violated. The second two, we disagree with the grounds for doing this. In both cases, these were instances of mismanagement in government, identified by the government's own auditing and inspection services, and which were later addressed through actions taken by government. We would suggest that both of these are a little bit rather like shooting the messenger. When you get bad news, you don't necessarily need to immediately suspend disbursements. And this is an issue we come back to. And it's, of course, a reflection of the point I was making earlier about the difficulties of managing budget support with the skepticism back home and the belief that one teacher getting a double pay in Mozambique means that there's a big problem with fraud. This isn't necessarily the case. But it's difficult in this sort of environment to manage these processes in an objective and rational way. That's one of the issues that we need to think about in going forward on budget support. So, the other big aspect of aid effectiveness and the contribution to aid effectiveness of budget support is the policy dialogue process. The policy dialogue process is relatively complicated. It involves a performance assessment framework for the development partners, a performance assessment framework for the government, a set of sector dialogues, some of which are formalized in terms of matrices and annual reviews, an annual review for the overall process, and in addition there's a more ad hoc process of assessing fulfillment of underlying principles for budget support. And there's certain issues such as dealing with the payroll problem in the education sector, which are then made subject to matrices of special attention. So it's quite a complicated process. For the most part, following the colour scheme, you can see that the annual review process works relatively well in terms of having relatively low transaction costs, a reasonably strategic set of indicators, and a process which serves to generate dialogue. The performance assessment framework for the government is a key part of that, and in broad terms, that also works well. There's issues with performance assessment frameworks which rely just on indicators. Any indicator-based system of measurement has its weaknesses, and the PAF in Mozambique does. But for what it's worth, it's considerably better than many other neighbouring countries receiving budget support. The matrices of special attention related to the governance action plan, the education payroll, have worked relatively well. So in other words, once these problems have been identified, once a set of actions has been agreed, this process of following it has worked well. What's worked less well is the sector dialogue, which is very varied. And this is an important point, because any kind of central process must rely on good policy ideas, good policy targets coming up from the sector level. So the sectors that have worked well, such as education, had a pretty good sector policy, a good set of targets. These fed in quite neatly into the annual review. The sectors that worked less well, such as agriculture, did not have very good targets, and the budget support process did not really have any impact in improving those. Again, something we need to come back to. The other, in this case, red bit, is the performance assessment framework for the development partners. Mozambique was, I think, unique in establishing, alongside the performance assessment framework for government, a parallel one for the development partners, which looked at aspects of aid effectiveness, harmonization, alignment, predictability of disbursements, etc. Up until 2010, this process worked very well. Since 2010, the results, the scores of the development partners have been very poor, reflecting partly a change in attitudes, that there is less attention given to aid effectiveness, reflecting possibly a little bit of a change in the severity of the measurement system as well. But it is clear that the aid effectiveness goals, which were such an important part of the budget support process from 2000 until about 2010, have become less important in recent years, and this is having a knock-on effect on the nature of relations and the quality of dialogue. Part of the reason seems to be that there is a bit of a missing process. In other words, if aid effectiveness is not working, what happens? Who does what? In some cases, government needs to do things to make it easier for the donors to be more aligned. And it's not always clear that that process by which government and donors can work together to correct problems is really existing. Whereas in the case of government, the matrices of special attention, the work at the sector level, comprise the process by which problems are resolved. And although there's weaknesses at the sector level, the process at least exists. Here we've got a gap, and that's something we need to think about. So, at one level, a mixed picture. There is always problems with the policy dialogue process, but in terms of fundamental achievements and comparing the period before with the period after, we've got a system of annual reviews which is coherent, which is linked to the poverty reduction strategy, which has targets, which is public, which is involving civil society. So in many ways, there's been a step forward in terms of the framework for discussion. It's a question of how to make it better. Okay, beginning to look at the induced outputs. Macroeconomic performance has been one of the highlights of the process, and we've got really some very impressive statistics across several different aspects. Total expenditure, I'm not quite sure how good your eyes are at the back of the room there, but for example, total expenditure in 2005 was just under 24% of GDP, and in 2012 it was just under 33%. So very nearly 10 percentage points of GDP higher. And you've got to realize that GDP is growing at 7% a year in this period. So in terms of actual money, this is a dramatically larger amount of money spent on public sector services and public sector regulatory activities. That has been done in part because of the budget support process, and we can see this in particular when we look at the investment component. So the investment component here is separated between externally financed and locally financed. Externally financed is essentially projects and common basket funds. Internally financed comes from the government budget, including, of course, budget support. And the big change here is from 3% of GDP domestically financed capital spending to 6% of GDP. So a doubling of the amount of money going from the budget towards capital spending. And simultaneously with this, revenue growth has been very fast, rising from 13.4% in 2005 to, again, about 10 percentage points higher in 2012. So a very important improvement in revenue processes, which has meant that the overall balance before grants has been, for the most part, stable. There was a bit of a jump in 2009 due to the global financial crisis, but it's beginning to stabilize again. So there's not many countries that would have a macro performance to match this. The blip on the horizon, and it's an important blip we'll come back to, is about the wider context for doing business. Essentially during this period, the doing business indicators have scarcely changed. And across a number of indicators of competitiveness, Mozambique is not performing as well as its neighbors. And this is almost certainly having an impact on the process of employment growth and creation. One thing I didn't mention is that Mozambique joined the extractive industry, sorry, I've got the acronym wrong there, that should be EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative in 2012. Having spent some 3 years in the process of accession. So it is now EITI compliant, which is quite an important point in moving forward towards the mining boom. Just to look a little bit more closely at the impact of budget support, Some of you who've been involved with the evaluations I've worked with will be maybe too familiar with this diagram, but I hope it won't bore you. What we do here is to basically try and stack up expenditure in terms of the degree of discretionality. In other words, if government didn't get budget support at all, what would it be able to stop? And some things it can't stop. It can't stop debt servicing, that has to be paid. It essentially can't stop paying salaries, those also have to be paid. For the most part, it can't do very much about goods and services spending through the recurrent budget. The bits where it might begin to have some discretionality would be on transfers and on the different aspects of investment spending. And we can see this. Governments that have had suspensions in budget support, Malawi fairly recently, Kenya in the past, we see in the subsequent years that the cuts come very directly in domestically financed development spending. So it's clear that this is the area of discretion which government expands when it gets the extra fiscal space provided by budget support. So what we see here, we've superimposed on this the level of domestic revenue. This dotted line shows how much the government has been collecting in revenue, and the gap between that line and this orange line is the contribution of budget support. This top gap are the externally financed projects and common basket funds, which, as you can see, very largely correspond to this top area here related to externally financed spending. So what we can see is at the beginning of the period, Mozambique would have struggled to have any domestically financed development spending, and indeed would have struggled to meet its recurrent bills. And budget support allowed the recurrent costs to be fully covered and for a certain level of domestic investment spending to also take place. So quite an important contribution, and it's exactly where you would want money to go if you wanted to make a difference to the development performance of another country. In terms of sectors, we show here the relative allocations to the priority sectors. The priority sectors in Mozambique are education, health, agriculture, infrastructure, good governance, and then a cluster of others, which are just called other. At the beginning of the period, those comprised 61% of total spending, which was equivalent to 14.4% of GDP. At the end of the period, it was a higher proportion of total spending, 67%, nearly 22% of GDP. Within those, the one that has increased most is the education, which increased its share to nearly 6.5% of GDP. Health declined for the most part. We'll have a look at that in a minute. Agriculture improved slightly, but the major gains have been education, agriculture, and to a degree good governance. Now, the question is, what's the contribution of budget support to that process? Again, it's a difficult question to ask or even to answer, because budget support is fungible, it's used in the same way as Mozambican taxpayers. So what we have done is to look at the distribution of domestic revenue in the period of 2004 and to map forward that distribution by sectors, assuming that there was no change. So in other words, we're saying that extra domestic revenue was distributed in the same way as the domestic revenue from 2004, and then over and on top of that we have external projects and budget support. External projects are shown by this green line here. The red bit here shows internally financed development spending, and the blue bit shows recurrent spending. In the case of education, if Mozambique had simply allocated the same sector share of domestic revenue right through the period, it would only have been able to finance that much. So the domestically financed capital spending on schools, for example, and the increased recurrent spending, in particular on teachers, was made possible by budget support. So that gap there represents the contribution of budget support. By contrast, in the health sector, we have an inverse relationship. Because there's been so much additional funding, in particular from the vertical funds, but also from other types of common funds, so different types of external funds, the Mozambican government has, in my view rationally, reduced the allocation of resources from the budget. So if it had allocated the same amount as it had been in 204, the allocation to the budget would have been here. But in practice, it was down here. So budget support has not contributed at all to the health sector. Indeed, the level of government funding for the health sector has declined, reflecting the increase in allocations from projects and common basket funds. We see a similar pattern in the case of infrastructure. So the more money you put into projects, the less, logically, government puts into it, showing that fungibility is much more powerful, perhaps, than we thought it was. The areas where budget support has contributed are here, in education, good governance, where we see a gap at the top, and in the more recent years, for agriculture. Health and infrastructure, the growth has been financed by externally financed projects. This is an important finding because one of the key areas of impact that we will have a look at is actually in the education sector. So the improvements in outcomes in the education sector have been linked to the improvements in spending, and our econometric analysis shows that in general, the precise areas of spending, so teachers, teacher training, schools, textbooks, have been exactly the right inputs to get the outcomes which have resulted. Okay, moving on. Public finance management is another area of debate, another area of dialogue. It comprises roughly a quarter of all of the indicators in the PAF, and as a result of that dialogue and as a result of the capacity building provided, there's been improvement right across the board. The government of Mozambique has undertaken 3 PIFA assessments of its PFM system in 2006, 2008 and 2010. 2010 is the green bit, which, as you can see, in nearly every case shows an improvement from earlier years. The red bit is the 2008 assessment, the blue bit is the 2006 assessment. The very biggest improvements have been in external scrutiny and audit, in cash management and in revenue collection. But as we can see, in other areas there's also improvement. Why has this happened? It's clear that the government had a demonstrated commitment to improve its PFM system. There was a PFM reform program in place from the beginning, which has been followed. There's been a prominent role for PFM reform in the budget support dialogue. And there's also been, as I said, some technical assistance and quite a strong sense of synergy between the discussions in the budget support process and the areas which were given capacity building and technical support. Moving forward, there's issues which the government needs to be aware of. We've discussed them in more detail in Maputo. The first is that as reforms become more complicated, the issue of sequencing also becomes more complicated. Mozambique is in the process of increasing the degree of computerization of its financial management system, and to a degree we find that computerization has gone ahead of the legal and conceptual design of the PFM system, which may potentially cause problems in the future, and that's something to be looked at. The other key issue is that as Mozambique goes into a mining boom and as it becomes a country receiving much larger levels of revenues, an increasing proportion of these will not be spent by the central government but by the wider public sector. In parastatals, in private-public partnerships, in semi-autonomous agencies. And the degree of scrutiny of those agencies therefore needs to improve. That's a major source of fiscal risk if this is not part of the PFM program. But as I say, these issues have been discussed in Mozambique and they're broadly acknowledged by the Ministry of Finance. Good governance is one of the thorny issues, and as you can see from my color scheme, it's orange, so some intermediate level of progress. The most significant areas have really been in terms of transparency and the different aspects of transparency. So looking first at the work of the Tribunal Administrativo. The Tribunal Administrativo is Mozambique's supreme audit institution, equivalent to a national audit office. And we've had some dramatic improvements in the coverage and the quality of external audits, from something like 68 audits per year in 2005 to 450 per year in 2012. And alongside this, there's been a big expansion in the number of qualified auditors and in the capability of the Tribunal Administrativo, supported in part by an increasing budget. You'll remember from my little graph that the good governance sector was one of the beneficiaries of budget funding, including from budget support. And it's also received technical assistance and common basket funding support through a common fund. There remains a question mark about whether audit reports are being used as well as they should be. I think that can probably be said for most countries in the world, but it's nevertheless an issue, and it's an area that we have identified for further attention. In terms of parliamentary scrutiny, transparency improvements have improved on the Open Budget Index. We continue to have problems with the capability of the Parliamentary Commission on Budget and Finance. It's a relatively small team of people. They don't have very much technical support. Their ability to bring the government to task on issues related to the budget is still not as great as it should be. In terms of media and civil society, we've seen improvements in the availability of budgetary documents. Mozambique scores relatively well in the worldwide governance indicators for voice and accountability. But alongside this, almost every civil society organization whom we spoke to during the evaluation stressed that they felt that the government was increasingly averse to criticism and that it was becoming more difficult to voice concerns about public policy. Looking at corruption, it's certainly the case that the legal and institutional framework has been strengthened. There were very few anti-corruption laws in 204, 205. There's now a package of laws which have been established. There is now an institution, the GCCC, the Gabinete de Control e Combate da Corrupção, the Agency for the Control and Combating of Corruption, and they have begun to implement their legislation. So in 2012, 88 court cases were prosecuted by the GCCC, an increase from 0 at the beginning of the period. So, I mean, at one level, we've started from 0, we've introduced a system, we've got laws to back it up, and this is a big change. At the same time, when we talk to civil society in Mozambique, the perception is that it's not always the right cases that are being taken to court, and that perhaps there are other more, shall we say, cases more deserving of being prosecuted, which are being forgotten or for which evidence is not being found. Obviously, this is an issue. All I would say is that we'd probably find exactly the same thing if we were to ask questions about the Serious Fraud Office here in the European Union. It's often the case that the biggest and most egregious cases of corruption are the ones that are best covered up. And it's the trivial cases of corruption that are least well covered up. So to a degree, this is, it's obviously an issue, and it's obviously a concern, but from our perception as evaluators, it doesn't take away from the finding that there's been improvements, and improvements on which the country can build in the future. Okay. So putting all that together in terms of step 1, we've got a broadly positive picture in terms of the efficiency of budget support as a mechanism of transfer, as a mechanism of dialogue, and we've got a set of induced outputs on PFM, on resource allocation, on macro stability, which have been positive, and some improvements in relation to good governance. So far, so good. Step 2 begins to look at impacts. And let's start first with the big area of positive impact. And I want to stress this because it seems a bit boring to talk about expanding education coverage, but the numbers here are really very dramatic. This is primary education enrollment, this is secondary education enrollment, males in red, females in blue, and the green line is the total. Because population statistics are not very reliable, we've actually used the 3 household surveys. So this is the proportion of the respondents to the household surveys who had children in school. And this gives us a pretty good, because these are nationally representative samples, this gives us a pretty good picture of the net enrollment rate. So we have a net enrollment rate in primary, in other words, enrollment of children of the right age, of 75% towards the end of the period, The Ministry of Education report that it's a good deal higher since, and we absolutely believe them, but we don't have the population data to check it. Nevertheless, just working on the data for which we are confident, we can say that there's been some dramatic improvements. And in terms of gender balance, the difference here between girls and boys in primary school is now only 4%. So we're close to gender parity of primary. We're quite a deal further away from gender parity. The difference here is 17%. But still, some improvements on both scores. The raw numbers are also interesting to look at. We've got 40% more children in primary and 65% more children in secondary at the end of the period in comparison with the beginning of the period. So I can't quite remember exactly how many thousand children that stands for, but it's a lot. And there's not too many countries that have had that expansion of education coverage in a period of 7 to 8 years. Quality-wise, there's been some increase in repetitions, some decline in completion rates, which is scarcely surprising because in both primary and secondary, we're now addressing pupils whose parents never went to school, who don't have the support of a household with books and parents who can help them with their homework. And that's exactly the target group that find it most difficult to stay in school. So it's not entirely surprising that dropouts have increased, but the increase in dropouts is not dramatic, and it doesn't take away from the very important achievements on the coverage side. So, a big plus on the education side. I won't talk you through this in detail, but the key finding from our econometric analysis is that, logically, the teacher-to-pupil ratio is a major determinant of performance in primary school and progression into secondary school. Smaller class sizes are also, again, rather obviously, associated with approval into secondary school. And this possibly suggests that there needs to be some slight change in policy to focus much more specifically on those schools with larger classroom sizes and those districts which are higher preponderance of large classrooms. But broadly, the econometric data suggests that the pattern of spending, including the pattern of spending by district, sorry, not by district, by province, has been efficient and effective. Now, the rest of the econometric analysis, the step 2 analysis, is less positive. We've had positive change on education, very little change in relation to malnutrition, and income poverty has not reduced, despite the fact that we've had a fast rate of growth. What seems to be happening is that within growth, the relative importance of consumption has declined. So what we have seen is a big increase in investment. So a higher proportion of this growth is comprised of investment and not of increases in consumption. And within the consumption basket, this has been skewed towards the richer deciles of the population, which is why growth is not impacting on poverty. But looking at a more sectoral basis, another reason why growth is not impacting on poverty is because productivity in agriculture has remained extremely low, and the use of fertilizer and improved inputs has remained extremely low. In Mozambique, the use of fertilizer is by about 3 to 4% of small farmers. And despite this, all of the farmers that do use fertilizer are achieving improvements in productivity between 4 and 7 times. And that is true across the whole nation, regardless of whether the province is wetter or drier, close to market or further to market. The variation between 4 and 7 is obviously explained by rain and proximity to market. But in all cases, fertilizer dramatically increases productivity, and if the level of usage could be increased from 4 to 12, 20%, we would get a very big knock-on effect on rural incomes, reductions in importation of food, and a number of knock-on effects which are likely to impact on poverty. So, the big question is, why did agriculture policy not address this productivity problem, and why did budget support not have any input on that process? One of the arguments made is that the overall level of public spending has been too low, but what you might have noticed from the earlier data is actually that in the last 3 years there's been quite a significant increase in spending on agriculture, and it's reached 8% of total spending in 2012, which is only just below the target of 10% which NEPAD has adopted. Our judgment is that the evidence shows that the problem lies more in the composition of agricultural spending. Pro-Agri was the Common Basket Fund established to provide support to the agriculture sector, and much of the growth financed by Pro-Agri was in fact in areas related to institutional development, including the expansion of staff in administrative functions, the improvement of salaries for these staff, increased spending on policy and planning processes, some of which may be of use. We're not trying to suggest that this is a useless spend, but on the other hand, there's been very little increase in spending on services for farmers and on actions to improve access to inputs. So the balance has been wrong. Too much institutional development, not enough attention to the farmer. And budget support processes were unable to have any significant influence on this process. One of the key things that struck us, looking at all of the 20 indicators which were used for the agriculture sector throughout the period, not one of them related to the degree of access or use of fertilizers or improved seeds or pesticides. The indicators that were used related to land registration, extension services, and a variety of other things. Irrigation was another thing, but none focused on this central problem, which had already been identified by policy documents in Mozambique. So bringing it all together, we have a situation in which a modality which was already functioning reasonably well at the beginning of the period as a mechanism of dialogue and resource transfer continued to function well and continued to get results in a number of important areas, notably PFM, macro stability, allocations to priority sectors, and some improvements in governance. As a result, we got a big impact on education, less so on quality, but a very important impact on the coverage of education. But we have a number of other areas that were largely ignored. And here we would say that there's a problem in the dialogue. That if agriculture was not a key part of the attention of government, then something should have been done to make that possible. If malnutrition was not a key part of the public policy debate, then again, something should have been done to make it possible. And here we make the link with what I was saying earlier about the weakness in sector policy dialogue. The PAF worked well to group together indicators from the sectors that were working well. Where a sector wasn't working well and wasn't generating a set of policy targets that would make a difference, such as agriculture, we either ended up with a mediocre set of indicators or with none at all. So there were no indicators in the PAF, for example, related to malnutrition. And yet Mozambique has one of the highest levels of malnutrition, unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa. So looking forward, the issue is to find ways of addressing these areas more thoroughly and getting more results on poverty, whilst preserving the progress made in these areas and fine-tuning the framework of dialogue that has been established. Looked at from the perspective of the skeptics, this suggests that despite this being a rather difficult time, quite a lot was achieved. And if there'd possibly been a bit less skepticism, we might have had more achievements and more constructive debate in some of these areas that were largely outside of the remit of the policy dialogue of the last 6 to 7 years. Okay? So those are really our main findings. People always like our picture, which tries to pull it all together. In terms of contributions, the major contributions have been from funding. Budget support has provided, as I said earlier, somewhere between 10 and 18% of public spending during this period, and it's provided it in a predictable manner, which has helped to increase public investment and it's helped to increase priority sector spending with a direct knock-on effect on education sector coverage and some effect on economic growth. less effect on income poverty, although I think it's probably true to say that if public investment had been lower and growth had been lower, probably we would have had higher levels of poverty still. It's difficult to look at the counterfactual. In terms of dialogue, we see good progress or some moderate influence, to use the terminology, on public finance management and on democratic accountability. Less influence on policies. Notably, we've got the gap in relation to agriculture, counterbalanced by the positive things on education. And less direct influence on macroeconomic management. Not because macroeconomic management was bad, more because the driving influence here is the debate with the central bank and with the IMF. So the budget support process is a supporting function to improved macro management rather than a driving function. But anyway, those are our final conclusions. We'll be talking about recommendations later. Thank you very much.